see how much overlap there is between different holidays and the rituals they depict in their images on postcards, we are literally witnessing the process by which the standardization and differentiation into separate holidays, each with their individual attendant customs, happened. Somehow during this process, Leap Year Day and Halloween lost their associations with love and courtship, and Valentine's Day became the main greeting card and sentimental token exchange holiday. Greeting cards and postcards both played a large part in the commodification of holidays, yet they were so much more than that too. People sending and using greeting cards and postcards were certainly attempting to transmit a piece of their own subjectivity and identity to each other, and were showing that they participated in the market economy every time they selected an image, wrote a message, and licked a stamp. Something similar still happens today. How often do we wish that we could make or handwrite something sentimentally endearing for a friend or family member? How often do we buy a card instead? Does the fact that we buy a card instead negate our intentions or somehow suggest that our affections and sentiments are not real? Obviously not. But the very act of buying and sending a greeting card attests to our at least having enough disposable income to do so. Again, Schenck notes, quote, "Greeting cards are not simply the drab results of the commodification of desire, the transformation of love and social connection from an intimate personal relationship to an object of exchange. In their delightful ambiguity, greeting cards enact the perverse objectivity of social longing in a culture structured by large-scale business," end quote. That is, by engaging in the marketing of sentimentalism, greeting card and postcard users were not expressing only their personal feelings, but were also demonstrating that they were able to participate in the wider public arena. I shop, therefore I am, but I still love you. The business of the greeting card did, however, begin with Valentine's Day, hence its lasting hold on these objects of exchange. The story of Valentine's Day in the United States is complex, and the persistent retelling of the origins of United States commercial Valentine's Day images is shrouded in ambiguity. The most common story holds that in 1847, a young woman in Worcester, Massachusetts, Esther Howland, saw a few imported valentines in her father's bookbinding and stationery store. Certain that she could make prettier cards than those imported from Europe, Howland made a few prototypes using scraps of paper from the family shop. Her father and brothers subsequently added her cards to their line of merchandise. From here, Howland began a brisk business producing valentines that were not celebrated so much for their texts and captions as for their careful and layered mix of paper, lacework, and ornamental scenes. As both Schmidt and Schenck have noted, throughout the 19th century, story after story and essay after essay remarked that Howland's Valentine production room was not the ugly, mass production, dirty assembly line of other industrial ventures, but rather that under her employ, many a young woman efficiently and productively spent her time in the light-hearted work of producing valentines. Of course, valentines were handmade and circulated in the United States well before and well after Howland's entrepreneurial spirit turned them into an industry. But the commentary around her valentine production line stuck closely to notions of women's sentimentality, cleansed it of any dirty association with common factory conditions, and then tied it to industrialization. In Howland's production rooms, conditions were pleasant, the work not so hard, and the resulting cards were imbued with the finer sentiments of a proper woman's heart, beautifully wrought and interwoven into embossed paper and lacework. Yet Howland was, of course, also a businesswoman and made not immodest profit from her ventures. Schenck compellingly argues, quote, "Linking love with material production, interiority, or the inside complexity of a person with the sensual textures of complex objects, and the changing conditions of work with the possibilities for affection, affiliation, and marriage, the production and exchange of commercial valentines helped establish the matrix of emotion and interiority," end quote. Regardless of Howland's success in the number of homemade valentines that were produced and saved during these years, most commercial valentines were still primarily those of the comic variety that we've already seen. They were, bottom line, far cheaper to produce, and profits were far superior to any other type of valentine. The preeminence of the comic valentine lasted throughout the 19th century, as the front page of Harper's Weekly lamented exactly 130 years ago today, on February 21st, 1880, quote, "The spirit and sentiment of St. Valentine's Day are fading. The world is growing too prosaic. Lovemaking and matrimony are no longer conducted on the principle of a bashful lover worshipping from afar off, and under the disguise of an incognito, some shrinking maiden who revels in the mystery of an unknown adorer. Marriage is walked up to by both parties in a businesslike fashion. Neither is the least timid, and the matter is put through according to rule, and as if it wore only the features of an ordinary contract. This has nearly done away with the occupation of good St. Valentine, and the missives he now presides over are too often only annoying and insulting communications, pointed by caricature, and sent by persons who have no regard for the feelings of others, end quote. What is immediately striking in the language used here to describe Valentines in 1880 is that it barely differs from the language used 30 years later to discuss the ways postcards were used in courtship rituals, or the language used to discuss letter writing during the 1830s. Consider the long history of bemoaning the loss of courtship rituals, then, the next time you see a teenager sending a text message to his or her love interest. In addition to Howland's Valentines, another major player, also from Worcester, Massachusetts, was the George C. Whitney Company. Whitney began producing Valentines in 1865, as soon as he returned home from the Civil War. Yet his mass-produced cards could not compete aesthetically with Howland's, since no machinery could yet handle the intricate business of lifting sheets of paper to place and glue various other materials in between the layers. Instead, Whitney settled on processes that standardized shapes for his Valentines and relied not on actual multiple layers, but on techniques such as embossing, gilding, and cutting away that could all occur on the same piece of paper. His ability to streamline his process and his fortunate good business sense allowed the Whitney Company to weather the changes in popularity from greeting cards in the late 19th century to postcards at the turn of the century and back to greeting cards again, which obviously have persisted in the popularity to this day. Whitney modernized his production process far ahead of other greeting card and postcard producers, enabling his business to stay afloat during these shifts in style and taste. Indeed, the Whitney Company bought out Howland's business in 1879 and continued to produce Valentines into the 1950s. One of the ways that he did this was by marketing and, quote, promoting the practice of exchanging Valentines among schoolmates, and by creating a special line of Valentines to be given to teachers, end quote. The tradition that school children still participate in was the marketing ploy of one of the country's first and most successful greeting card companies that also happened to be a major postcard producer during the Progressive era. While it is not my intent or purpose to discuss more recent Valentines or exchange patterns in this talk, Whitney's marketing ploy does raise the last point I'd like to discuss today, namely, why so many of the images that we see on historic Valentines and greeting cards are representations of small children. It seems highly ironic that a holiday that depends on the nuanced rituals of courtship and love between adults also depends on armies of small children to express itself. We all know that children are notoriously good at getting to the point, but there is clearly something else going on here. Looking still at the Valentines on the screen, especially this one, we have to wonder how these two tots could possibly be in the market for a new house. Given the incredible amount of anxiety and tension that other visual images on postcards produced, is it safe to assume that there might be anxiety at work in these visions of cherubic youngsters too? I think that there is. The first issue, I would argue, is the long-standing concern over the sexual and erotic lives of children. Children, of course, are not supposed to have those kinds of feelings. But these images first became popular as the sexuality of children became apparent in the 19th century, and as psychology, with its emphasis on the sexual identification processes of children and men and women, evolved in the early 20th century. Prior to this, it was less common to see children used to represent adult emotions and sensuality. But more importantly for our topic at hand, I think that part of the way that users of sentimental greeting cards and postcards mediated their anxieties over love, sex, and attachment was by containing those feelings within images of innocent youths. The alternative, of course, would be to blatantly admit passionate feelings. Since women throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th were by all accounts not supposed to have sexual appetite